No, human beings are weird, you know, we love thinking about the future and we love sort of guessing what the future is going to be like and coming up with theories. At the same time, we're terrified of it. And this is kind of the theme for tonight. So thank you for coming to Naked Thoughts. I'm not sure how many of you guys got the email invite, but I described our first speaker as a cyborg expert. He's a lecturer of media studies at UJ, the University of Johannesburg. He's a movie fan, a big movie fan. He loves going to the movies. Says he spends way too much time there. And he's just finished his master's in English, and he's exploring this idea, the fascination that humanity has with post-humanism. Yeah? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, Stefan Kriek.
I noticed on the invite that I was called a cyborg expert, which, you know, when I was 10, my dream was either dinosaur expert, Pokemon trainer, or cyborg expert. So finally, I really get to live the dream, and this is freaking awesome. Good start. About a month ago, I'd say, I went to see a pulmonologist. It's a lung doctor. I was having these recurring cough, right? So I got a bit worried about it, trying to figure out, you know, what could it be? Maybe it's just your lung doctor, and you know how it works these days. You're like, well, maybe I should just Google my symptoms. And when you Google your symptoms, it's like, you know, you're fine, or cancer. So obviously I assumed that's fine, but it might be cancer. So I set up a meeting with the pulmonologist, and you know, everything went fine. I did a spirometer test. I just checked my lung functions, and everything looked good. Everything looked fine. Then I had to go for a CT scan as well. I wasn't sure why do I need to go for a CT scan, but she said, well, she just wants to check out the lungs. So the next day I went in, I did blood work, and I did a CT scan. And I went home, kind of still nervous. 2 hours later, I was expecting the doctor to phone me, and then 2 hours later, she phoned me. She phoned me with the results. I was fine. Nothing. There was really nothing wrong. The lungs looked perfect. That's actually not the purpose of what I'm studying this. The point is, I went back to her about 2 weeks later. All right, to kind of like just sit, and we sat there in their office. We were talking. And she showed me the CT scan, and we discussed it, tell me what could possibly be, maybe just some asthma. But at that moment, I was just so absolutely fascinated by this CT scan. Because at that very moment, while that scan was happening and she showed me the results, but that machine was inside me. Okay? As weird as that might sound. But so it was both outside and a part of me. Because in that very moment, while I was having the CT scan, I was a cyborg, which is pretty cool. Do you guys know what a cyborg is? Cool, I'm going to mansplain it. Perfect. The word is a portmanteau of cyber and organism. So it's the idea of using technology to enhance our bodies. That's usually what the idea is. More from a science fiction level, it's the idea of having a human that grafts technology to their body. You've seen The Terminator, and have you seen RoboCop? Because a lot of this rests on you having seen these movies. Okay, so think Terminator, right? Think Arnold Schwarzenegger, The Terminator, prime example. Think RoboCop. If anyone's seen the new Justice League movie, it's really bad, you shouldn't see it, but Cyborg is one of the characters there, so aptly named a cyborg, and obviously he is a cyborg. But, you know, I wish I could have told you like a cooler cyborg story. My story will have a point at some stage, but I wish I could have told you like, you know, hi, I'm John Connor and I'm fighting for the future of humanity. My fascination with the cyborg just started when I was very young. I just loved the idea of this entity. But as I grew up and I started reading science fiction, watching science fiction movies, I was trying to figure out, why are we so afraid of this entity, this cyborg? Why are we so instinctively afraid of it? Right? Even though it's something from science fiction, often science fiction eventually becomes science fact. If you tell someone, hey, would you mind grafting this toaster to your arm? They would instinctively say no. Or would you incorporate this piece of technology into your body, we revile, we stand back, we're saying that this is horrible. Except in cases of people having pacemakers or prosthetic limbs, then we tend to go, okay, well, I understand they need this to live, okay? But no one is going to run up to a doctor and say, Doc, cut off my legs. It's time we have a new, less murder-prone Oscar Pistorius. I've always, like I said, had that kind of fascination. But like I said, I've been trying to figure out exactly why we are so afraid of this creature, and especially even if you look at the stories that we've told, right? In our narratives, in our movies, the cyborg is often the bad guy. Now, a good example would be the Terminator. Great, you've got this horrific flesh and machine merger, and he goes up against the pure of body and pure of soul Sarah Connor. So it's machine versus human. The only time we're okay with this entity, right, is when they become, or when they claim to be, when we see the human side winning out over the machine side. For example, RoboCop. Also a movie, if you haven't seen it, you should definitely go and see it. There's a line in RoboCop, I think the ending line, I think it's RoboCop 3, don't see that one, it's garbage. But it's got that line at the end, my friends call me Murphy, but you might call me RoboCop. Then the audience go, yeah, I can relate to that guy. We find these characters relatable. In RoboCop, for example, we find him relatable the moment he begins to have flashbacks about his youth, about his wife and about his child. Then we go, now I can relate to you. The same thing from the second Terminator, which is also a really good movie. The bad guy in that one is a fully machine entity, whereas the good guy is the bad guy from the first one, the cyborg. But Terminator 2 has this very good subplot where the young John Connor tries to teach the robot to be more human, to make him more relatable. I don't know if you ever saw it's got a really good director's cut where you actually see a whole scene where John Connor tries to teach the robot to smile. So you as the audience go, even though he's a horrible machine monster, he's smiling. And that makes him relatable. So I was trying to, again, get to the bottom of this idea of like, okay, but what motivates our fears for this entity? And a lot of my research eventually stemmed down the path of there seems to be two elements. This idea that we as man, descendant from God, God made man in his own image. And then this other idea about natural versus unnatural. Especially from Western society, Western predominantly Christian society, or largely, again, there's this idea that man was sculpted in God's image, right? So we have this idea that we are this perfect, infallible entity. This mustn't change because this is the vessel for the soul, or whatever you want to call it, or it's the vessel for human nature. The moment we think we change the body, we think we might change what inevitably makes us human. There was a philosopher, he was called Francis Fukuyama, and he wrote a book about our post-human revolution, quite more apocalyptic, his viewpoints. But he called this idea of the soul or the human nature, he called it factor X. That, okay, if you're non-religious, whatever, we just call it factor X. The idea that all humans have what he calls factor X. Call it the soul, call it human nature, whatever you want to call it. And he said that is what makes us distinct from rocks and plants and dogs and cats and the works. There's this idea that we all have a factor X. And the moment we award something factor X, we deem it to be human. And the moment we remove something's factor X, it becomes subhuman. A good example of us as humans having done this was actually about 150 years ago. If you think about slavery, we find slavery abhorrent now. But back then, to dehumanize a race was fine. That's why slavery could function. If you were black, you were deemed as subhuman. So Fukuyama used that example to say, we effectively stripped factor X. But his whole argument was, the moment we give that to someone, they have a soul. Your body must remain pure. And then we also have the other problem, natural versus unnatural. We have this idea that nature is the baseline for what is perfect. That the closer you are to nature, the better something is. Don't take antibiotics, take Eye of Newt, because some shaman told you to. It's this idea of, if you ever had an argument with someone who's an anti-vaccination, avoid it rather, but you find it's often about these, it goes along the same lines. I don't know what they're injecting my child with. It's a lot of these chemicals. Even though everything has chemicals, we assume that when it's made in a lab, it's unnatural, it's chemicals. Even though our whole world is composed out of chemicals. The same if you talk to someone who is opposed to the idea of genetically modified food, which is also a huge, huge no-go, because, again, the idea that, despite the fact that we've been genetically modifying our food for hundreds of years, there is this idea that, when we modify food now, it's done in a laboratory, unnatural science. The scientist is sitting there and is injecting cancer into your tomato. So these are some of the assumptions that we have. But here's the funny thing. So like I said, we have this idea that we must remain stable and unchanged. But here's the thing, right? As you are all sitting here, we're already all cyborgs. Not the cool kind, okay, but we're getting there. But think about yourself, right? What's probably the one thing you can't do with, okay, this is maybe a bit broad, because you need oxygen and a bunch of stuff to live. But think about on your person. If there's one thing that you can't lose, I hope we're on the same page here, it's your cell phone. Even though people say, I don't need a cell phone, you all need a cell phone. Your cell phone isn't just a tool, it is a physical extension of you. It's maybe not it's not been implanted into your brain yet, give it some time, but it is a way with which you reach out to the world, right? Your cell phone is a metaphysical limb. So much of you is on your cell phone. It's not grafted to you, but it is a part of you. The same with when you type on a keyboard. Your finger strokes merging with technology, in that very moment, you and the computer are one. We are all sitting, being bathed in so many signals and signs. You are sitting right in the middle of so much data that it's effectively becoming a part of you. I mean, also, if you think about it as well, they've said that the first person that's going to reach 150 years old has been born. And they're not going to reach 150 by crystal healing and quinoa shakes. They're going to reach 150 thanks to incorporating technology, making that part of our bodies. So at least now you can see why my first story eventually made sense. It came full circle right back to this point. So what I'm just basically trying to say is that we might be afraid of the robot, but the robot is already here. It's already kind of like part of us. We tend to think these big changes will happen. You'll wake up one day and there'll be a machine army around you and it's going to be the end of the world. But these changes happen gradually. And I tend to think as humans, we tend to assume that the worst will happen. But I don't always think that's the case. I think technology is there and it can enhance us in good and positive ways, and that we should actually embrace these kinds of changes. Like I said, we're already part cyborg in any way. I know for one that if given the opportunity, if someone comes to me and say, listen, I'm going to inject you with nanobots right now and you can live to 200, I do it. And I'm sure many of you would as well. Thanks a lot, people.